Dear friends, we come to chapter 8 of our study, of our reflection, reading of the Gospel of John. And in chapter 8, in the beginning, the first part, we have the episode of the woman caught in adultery, 1 to 11. And from verse 12 onwards, we have the presentation of Jesus as the light of the world. And the second part, from verse 12 onwards, we can again divide it into three sections. From verse 12 to 20, the Father testifying to Jesus. From 21 to 30, we have Jesus speaking about his own return to the Father. And the final section from 31 to the 59, the end of this chapter, there is the question about the descendants of Abraham, the whole controversy about Jesus and Abraham. Coming to the first section, from verse 1 to 11, the episode of the woman caught in adultery. So the leaders, they bring this woman to Jesus, and they had their scriptural backing for that action. Because we read in Deuteronomy 22:22 that Moses had commanded such women simply to be put to death. And later on, when we read in Ezekiel 16:40 and so on, we get it gives us the indication that such women were put to death by stoning, probably by stoning. Of course, they brought this woman to Jesus in order to trap Jesus. For if Jesus were to say, let her go, and then he is breaking the Mosaic law. And if Jesus says, execute her, then Jesus seems to be very harsh, and also is going against the Roman law, because the Romans had taken away the right of the Jews to officially execute anyone for any religious offense. And we find that Jesus is dealing with this crisis in a very, with great wisdom. With great wisdom, he deals with this crisis. If you look at this episode in verse 6 and in verse 8, it is mentioned that Jesus he began to write with his finger on the ground. So when they are asking the question, what should we do? He is doing this strange action of writing on the ground with his finger. And it will take us back to Jeremiah, prophet Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 13, wherein it is said that those who forsake God, and that is a spiritual adultery that is spoken of in the Old Testament, those who forsake God, and those who forsake God will be written in the dust, it is said in Jeremiah 17:13. And so these people who bring this woman to Jesus are people who are committing adultery, the spiritual adultery, those who forsake God, those who refuse to believe in Jesus, the dispenser of living water, which we saw in chapter 7, and their names will be written in the dust as we read from the book of Jeremiah. Difference when we come to the second section from verse 12 onwards, which is actually the main content of this chapter, wherein Jesus would present himself as a light of the world. And he would say, this is again an I am saying of Jesus, I am the light of the world. Now, the context of this particular saying is in the Feast of the Tabernacles again, for which the temple and the courtyard were all lit up. And then that aspect of being the temple and the courtyard being lit up would have provided the occasion for the words of Jesus about light and darkness. Now, Jesus declares himself as a light of the world, as a light. We saw the mention of the light already in the prologue. There was the mention of the light. If you look at the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew 5:14, there is Jesus will speak to his disciples saying, you are the light of the world. And there is no contradiction here. The disciples are the light of the world in as much as they are able to reflect this true light, which is Jesus himself. Jesus, the true light. Now, this statement of Jesus that I am the light of the world, the light of life, the light which gives life, it has got a very, very, very close indication to his divinity. Once again, to his divinity, for God is light for a Jew. If you read Exodus 3:2-6 or Exodus 13:21, Psalm 36:7-9, it will all tell us that God is light. And the Jewish people believe that God is someone who gives them light, and God is light to them. And so if we, in Psalm 27:1 we read, the Lord is my light. Again in Isaiah 60:19, the Lord shall be your everlasting light. And later on, the later rabbis would mention about the Messiah, the light is the name of the Messiah. So the name of the Messiah is to be light. And again in the vision of Isaiah, which we read in 42:6 or 49:6, and again which is seen in the New Testament in Luke 2:32, the servant of the Lord will be a light to the Gentiles, it is said. The servant of the Lord, the Messiah, is to be a light to the Gentiles. And so when Jesus says, Ego eimi to phos to cosmo, I am the light of the world, it goes beyond all this what has been spoken of about the light in the Old Testament. For cosmos indicates all created life, all created life. So he's saying, I am the light to this entire universe, to all created life. So when it comes to, again in verse 21 in this chapter 8, we see that the Jewish people are seeking to kill him, but by his going away to the Father, Jesus would say they will die. Now they are seeking to kill Jesus, and Jesus is saying, I am going away, and by that very act of I going away, you will die because you refuse to believe. And so dear friends, in this chapter 8, especially when we come to verse 24, it clarifies what sin is. According to Johannine perspective, what is sin? And then it is defined as like that, defined as refusing to believe that Jesus is God, that is sin. So I read verse 24, you will say, I told you that you will die in your sin, for you will die in your sin unless you believe that I am He. In verse, and so the only way to escape death is to believe in Jesus. Coming to verse 28, again Jesus will mention about He being lifted up. We have already seen that in chapter 3 we saw that in his conversation with Nicodemus, verse 14, Jesus will mention about He being lifted up. Once again here he will speak about He being lifted up, and when Jesus is lifted up, all will realize that Jesus and the Father are one, that is, Jesus is God. Coming to the last section from verse from 31 onwards, we have got this controversy that is going on between Jesus and Abraham. We find that indeed the Jewish people will say in verse 33 that they have never been slaves. In fact, they have been slaves. We know that they have been slaves in Egypt, in Babylon, and now under the Romans. But then they say that being children of Abraham, they cannot really be enslaved. That's the conviction of the Jewish people. But then Jesus will say in verse 34 a different kind of slavery. He would say it's not about political bondage, but a bondage to sin. And again in 41, Jesus would say that they cannot be, these Jewish people cannot be Abraham's children, for their acts are different from that of Abraham. Abraham who welcomed God's messengers, Abraham who believed in God's word. These Jewish people, they are not the children of Abraham. He would say they are children, you are children of your father, and your father, there is a reference to Satan. And again, once again, in verse 41, we'll find the Jewish people will claim that God is their father. And in verse 47, Jesus will refute that claim of the Jewish people as well. And so this controversy develops, and at the end in verse 53, we see the Jewish people asking Jesus, are you greater than Abraham? Remember the Samaritan woman asking Jesus, are you greater than Jacob? Now the question is, are you greater than Abraham? Because according to the early Jewish tradition, Abraham foresaw all the secrets of the Messianic Age. And then comes in verse 58, Jesus would make that very famous statement, before Abraham was, I am. Now that is very important statement, for it says that Abraham is time bound. Abraham was. Jesus is not time bound. Jesus is. And once again, that is an indication about his divinity. For God is not time bound. God is always is, whereas Abraham was. And that sounded heretical to them, and they react with anger. And so this particular chapter 8, there is a series of conflict. Jews stubbornly refused to accept the one who could give them the light of life. They stubbornly refused to accept him. They hold stubbornly to their lineage, to their glory, and they refuse to become the children of God, which we read again in Prologue 1:13. So refusing to accept Jesus, they are in sin. They have chosen death for themselves. So dear friends, let us continue to read this chapter 8. Accept Jesus as the light of our life, believe in him, and thus free ourselves from that real bondage, the bondage of sin.